Alright, in this video I'll be expanding upon the step sequencer that I built previously, and I'll be adding a glide module so that we can glide between steps. So to begin with, let's add a new macro and rename it to glide. And I'm going to end up needing an input to the module that is the number of milliseconds for each step. And we've already calculated this value inside the clock macro, so we can simply add a new output to that macro and feed it into our new macro. And so this length in milliseconds is going to equal our maximum glide time, as I'll show you in just a minute. And inside the glide macro, the first thing I want to do is add an order module to trigger a sequence of events when we get a new value from our step sequence. And we're going to use the first output to set an accumulator to be equal to 0. And this accumulator is going to keep track of the amount of time since we have received a value from our step sequencer. So I'm going to use a system info module again, and we can divide 1000 over the control rate to get the length between events from the event clock in milliseconds. And we'll simply run that into the accumulator like so. And now the accumulator will output the length of time in milliseconds. So next let's create our glide knob and give it a range from 0 to 1. And we're going to multiply that against the incoming millisecond value. So now our glide time will range anywhere from 0 milliseconds to the maximum length, which is the distance in time between our steps. Alright, so now we can divide our timer over our glide length. And so when the timer is equal to 0, this divide will also be equal to 0. And as the time gets closer to the length of our glide time, the output of the divide will get closer and closer to 1. And so we can use this to control a selector scanner module with 2 inputs. And one thing to make sure is that you leave the curve setting of the selector scanner set to linear. It's set that way by default, but just make sure you don't change it. And the next thing we're going to do is create a value module that is going to hold our old value from our sequencer. And we're going to trigger the old value using the order module. And after that's happened, we're going to store our new value in the value module, and that will wait there until the next event comes in. So using that setup, we can send the old value from our sequencer to the 0 input of the selector and the new value to the 1 input. And then as our accumulator grows in size, we will morph between the old value and the new one using the selector scanner. So let's add this to our incoming note pitch. And before we do anything else, let's kind of change the look of our event table here. You can, in the View tab of the properties, you can select a few different looks. I kind of prefer just to go with the fill, which is a little simpler, and then you can change the color of the fill in the instrument properties in the View tab. And by going to the background fill column, you can enter red, green, and blue values for the event table. And all these values are from a maximum of 0 to 255, so to set it to red, for example, you can just simply set the red to the maximum amount and the green and blue values to 0, like so. Alright, so at this point, our glide works mostly the way that I would like it to. However, there's one small problem, and that is that we don't want the first step of the sequence to glide from its last value. We want it to just start playing. And right now we have no way of discerning what the first step of a sequence is, so we're not doing that. And here's just a quick example of what I'm talking about. Alright, so especially with the speed slowed down, you can tell that the first step is gliding from whatever the last value that it has stored in the glide macro, which is kind of undesirable. So we can fix this problem pretty easily. So basically what we want to do is just count the number of values we've received from our sequencer since the last time a new gate was pressed. So I'm just going to use an accumulator module, and we'll set it to 0 on a new gate, and then we can increase the value by 1 every time we receive an input. And it's pretty simple to set up like so. Alright, so now I'm going to compare this value to 0, and anytime it's less than or equal to 0, it means we're kind of receiving our first event from the sequencer, and we want to set the selector value to equal to 1. So we can just simply add a 1 to our value going into the selector scanner. And this will turn glide off for the first note of a sequence. Okay, and so the last problem that we're going to have with this is that it's actually not going to work to have our glide value range from 0 to 1, because if our glide is equal to 0, and in our structure we're going to end up dividing by 0, which does not really work mathematically, and Reaktor will handle that okay, but it will not give us the answer that we want. So the end event of that is that the sequence is going to play back delayed, and that sounds a little like this. Alright, so it might be a little hard to tell there, but basically it's playing back one note behind where it should be playing back. And if we simply set the minimum glide time to something like 0.001, then this problem will go away.